Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Manifestos are a bit like buses. You wait for ages and then they all come along at once. Labour were first out of the blocks with their manifesto yesterday, called for the many, not the few. Today it's the turn of the Liberal Democrats, and tomorrow it's the Tories. That's just been confirmed. The LibDems published their manifesto in the last few minutes. It's called Change Britain's Future. Where do they get all these snappy titles from? Anyway, they say it's aimed at giving young people a brighter future. Here's Joko with the details.
Yes, the flagship policy in the Liberal Democrat manifesto is their pledge to have a referendum on the terms of the Brexit deal that the UK negotiates with the EU. The Lib Dems want to give the British people the chance to reject what they say is the extreme and divisive Brexit being pursued by Theresa May. Aside from Brexit, the Lib Dems are offering to spend more money on public services. In particular, they would give the NHS and social care an extra £6 billion per year. They would get that £6 billion by raising all rates of income tax by 1%. And all of that extra money from income tax would be ring-fenced for the health and care budgets. On education, they would give just under £7 billion to schools and colleges over the course of the next Parliament. That would pay for things like protecting per pupil funding in real terms and tripling the early years pupil premium. That's extra money given to nurseries educating 3- and 4-year-olds from disadvantaged backgrounds. The Lib Dems would also build new rent-to-own homes. People taking part in the scheme would be able to gradually buy their homes by renting them for 30 years. They would reverse some of the welfare cuts. For example, they would restore housing benefit for 18 to 21-year-olds. And they would end the current cap on public sector pay. The Lib Dems would create a new young person's bus pass, which would give 16 to 21-year-olds in England a 2/3 discount on the buses. Let's take a look at Ed Davey, the former Lib Dem minister, setting out the party's Brexit policy this morning.
We think people are very upset about Brexit here in London. Many of them voted to remain. And we want to say that when the Brexit deal has been done, in 3-4 years' time, then people should have the right to vote on that deal and say whether they like it, and if they don't like it, they can vote to remain in the European Union. I think people are worried that the Theresa May-Nigel Farage coupling, where they're backing an extreme form of Brexit, is very damaging to people's futures, particularly young people's futures and their opportunity. So I think people do want a chance to vote again.
That was Ed Davey. We're joined now by Dick Newby, leader of the Lib Dems in the House of Lords. He was chair of the Manifesto Working Group. He's with us now. Welcome to the programme. Let me just clarify, in case viewers don't know, your party has ruled out joining any kind of coalition after this election.
Yes,
so you wouldn't be in any kind of government.
No, we would not. No. We're in the same position as the Labour Party.
So
we know who the government's going to be after the next election, and we're just being rather more honest about it.
Who's going to be the government?
It's going to be the Conservative Party.
All right. But if you're not going to join any coalition, what's the point of going through any of these policies with you?
Well, I think people want to know, when they're voting for us, what kind of country we want to live in.
Yeah, but you're not going to have a chance to implement it if you're not going into government. So what's the point?
But people vote for people who share their values and share their views about how the country should go going forward. And that's why you have a manifesto.
Yeah, but if the values, as you are claiming, are going to be the values of a May government, I assume you're going to win it by a landslide, and you would not get involved in any kind of coalition that could stop that from happening, then I say your policies are, what you stand for is irrelevant.
No, they're not.
The details are irrelevant.
No, they're not, because on a day-to-day basis, from the day Parliament gets back, we are going to be debating the government's policies and we're going to be voting on them. And the manifesto gives a guide to people about how we're going to behave and what we're going to be doing in the next Parliament.
All right. One of the policies you do have is to have a second referendum, a referendum on the deal if and when a deal for Brexit is done. Is that correct?
Yes, that is absolutely right.
Who said that a second referendum was, quote, disrespectful to the voters and counterproductive? Who also said if you're having 2 referendums, you might as well have 3.
Well,
who said that?
It doesn't matter who said it.
Well, I'll tell you who said it. Vince Cable said it.
Yes.
Of the LibDems, who's now on your front bench team.
Yes, well...
Disrespectful.
What we're saying is that people voted for a departure. They've no idea last year what they were going to get. So we say, at the end of the process, there are only two lots of people who can decide what we do about Brexit, either MPs or the people. If if it had been left to MPs before the last referendum, they were completely out of touch with the people. So we think a process started by the people should be completed by the people.
But if the European Union knows that there's going to be a referendum on the outcome of the negotiations, that gives them a huge incentive to give us the worst possible deal.
No, I think you're pinning too much faith on the powers of persuasion of the Lib Dems there. People in Europe...
Well, I've never made that mistake before.
Well, no, well, I didn't think you had, but I think you are now. I think that people in Europe are negotiating on the basis of getting a deal which they think is in the long-term interests of the EU, on the basis that we will leave. That's the only way they can do it. But it doesn't mean that that rules out us having a final say on it.
But if I'm negotiating for Brussels and you're negotiating for Britain, and I know that you have to put whatever we agree to the British people, I'm going to try and give you a punishment beating so that the British people think, whoa, we didn't realise it was going to be as bad as this. We're going to need visas to go there. We can't work anymore. Whoa, let's vote against it. I'm not going to give you a free trade agreement. I'm not going to give you tariff-free trade, am I?
But why does that work for the British people and not for parliamentarians? I mean, somebody decides, Andrew. It isn't just the Prime Minister. You have one body of people deciding in Parliament or a larger body of people, the country deciding. They're both going to react in the same sort of way to the attitude and the deal that comes out of Brussels, surely.
When would this referendum be?
Well, the Prime Minister says she can complete the negotiations within the time frame, so you would have it when she come back with a deal.
Would there be enough time?
Well, she says there is, so we're taking her at her word.
She's not been that explicit of when it can be done.
Well,
is it your contention that if the country was to vote against the deal, that we would just seamlessly stay in the EU?
That would be the proposition.
Well, who in Brussels has ever led you to believe that would be the case?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that from all the lawyers, from someone like Lord Kerr, who actually wrote Article 50, that it is revocable. You can stop the process if you want to do.
But have you had any indication from Brussels that that is the case? That's how they view it? Or have the European Court of Justice views it that way?
Senior jurists in the EU have said that the article is revocable. And we
Who are
believe
these
it to
senior
be...
jurists?
Well, former advisors to the Commission, former members of the European Court of Justice. Well, I haven't got a list of their names, but there's a long list of names. And John Kerr, who, as I say, wrote it.
Right, but he, of course, is just an observer now.
Yeah, but he knew what was in people's minds when it was written, because he had the pen.
I suggest he didn't, because when he wrote it, he never thought it would happen. He wrote it as an entirely academic exercise.
Well, he's not a sort of flippant sort of chap.
Oh, I wouldn't say that. He just didn't think it would happen. You didn't think it would happen.
Well, nobody thought it was going to happen, did they?
Oh, no, some people did. I mean, a lot of people didn't. One of them was Nick Clegg. And I just want to run you this clip of what he said. This is just before the country gave its verdict on Brexit, and he was speaking at the Oxford Union. He was debating with Nigel Farage. It was back in December 2015, before we got to the referendum.
Sure.
But what would happen if we had one? This is Mr. Clegg.
There will be some voices, and I hope it won't be Nigel or Sir William, because I think this is a fate that shouldn't befall them. They're decent characters. There will be some people. There will be some people who, like those Japanese soldiers who continued fighting the last war because no one had told them it had ended in some Pacific island, who will carry on arguing and arguing and arguing. The rest of us will just move on and carry on with the rest of our lives.
Now, that was Mr. Clegg talking about the die-hard leavers that wouldn't accept the result of the referendum. I put it to you that this country, having voted to leave, in your view, is about to elect a government with a landslide, with a mandate to push ahead with the Brexit negotiations. It's the Liberal Democrats who are now the Japanese soldiers in the jungle, and you don't realise the war's over and you lost.
No, I don't think we are the Japanese soldiers. I've been called many things in the past. This is a novelty for me, and I don't think
what bit of it's wrong? You're in denial.
But we're not at all in denial. We're saying to people, you decided you wanted to go down this path. And we're saying when you know where the path's leading, so it certainly didn't know where it was leading last year, you know where the path's leading, you then decide whether you agree that that's the path down which you want to go.
But Mrs May, I mean, she obviously can't go into all the details because the negotiations haven't even started, but she is essentially fighting this election on the Lancaster House speech. And in that, she's made it clear we cannot remain as members of the single market. We will not remain members of the customs union. We will not be subject to the jurisdiction of the ECJ. We will attempt to negotiate as wide as possible a free trade deal as is possible with all these other commitments about taking back control as she sees it. We know the broad outlines of what she's going to attempt to achieve, don't we? And she's going to, in your view, not mine, in your view, she's going to get a mandate for all that.
But she's going to get a mandate to be Prime Minister because there is no opposition coming from the Labour Party. People are not all voting on Brexit in this general election. They're voting about whether they think Jeremy Corbyn is fit to be Prime Minister.
Hold on, Dick Newby. Your whole appeal in this campaign has to be on Brexit. That's your distinguishing point.
But
that's the one thing that does distinguish.
It does distinguish us, and that's on which we're fighting.
Which is what makes you a Japanese soldier in the jungle. Let me tell you, soldier, the war, it's over, you lost. It's gone. Come on out, put your hands up, leave your rifle, we'll look after you.
No, somebody decides, Andrew, at the end. Is it MPs? Is it the people? We think it should be the people.
The people will have decided twice. They'll have decided in the referendum and in this election.
No, because we don't know the deal.
You want for a hat trick?
We know what the Prime Minister wants, which is a large measure of having your cake and eat it. We don't know what she's going to get. And so many of the things that were promised a year ago definitely aren't going to happen. So who knows where we're going to be at the end of the process? Your
whole election strategy has been based on the 48% who vote Remain. You want to try and pick up as many of them. But the latest YouGov poll suggests you've misread the mood of the British people. It no longer exists, this 48%. The country now seems to divide into 45% are hard leavers. They're hard leavers, not as much as the 52 who voted to leave. They're hard leavers. 23% are relievers. They are voted to remain, but they accept the outcome. They have come out of the jungle, put their hands up and said, yeah, we know the war's over. And only 22% are hard remainers, and you're struggling even to get them. The strategy is flawed.
No. We fight elections on what we believe. We believe that the people should have a final say. But we're also fighting, as Joe was explaining, about how do you fund the NHS on a sustainable basis? How do you stop schools having cuts per pupil of, in some cases, over 10%? All these are things that we're talking about on the doorstep. Some people have Brexit at the top of their minds. A lot of people don't, frankly. A lot of people are much more interested in whether they can get to hospital quickly. So we're setting out how you would deal with those problems as well.
Would it be fair to say, then, that your manifesto, which you admit you will have no chance of implementing, will be at least a guide as to how you will vote in Parliament under the next government? That's
it is, absolutely.
All right. What would be a good result for you?
Oh, a good result would be a significant increase in votes and seats.
What would significant be?
Well, significant means substantial.
And what does substantial mean?
Well, it's roughly the same as significant.
And to put a number on either of them, what would you think?
Only a fool would do that.
What's it like in the jungle?
I'm enjoying it.
Leave him alone.
Remember, my former leader, Lord Ashdown, was a jungle warrior.
He was indeed. Was he?
Oh, yes.
Was he in the jungle?
Dick Newby, don't go down that line. Michael, let me pick up on actually the last point that Andrew raised with Dick Newby, which is about domestic policies, about the health service, about education. I mean, do you welcome the fact that the Liberal Democrats have come forward with a bold policy of raising all rates of income tax by 1%, and that money will go into funding the NHS?
No, not at all.
Why?
Well, because, as all the headlines say today, people's living standards are under pressure, and the idea that you can help them by putting a penny on income tax at all levels is foolish. And the lesson that we've learned from the reductions in tax that we made, for example, when we cut the top rate of tax, is that revenues go up. So if you're going to put up tax, then in the longer term you're going to get less revenue, and that's not a sensible policy. And you're also going to reduce incentives and reduce people's living standards.
So you're expecting no tax rises in the Conservative manifesto of any sort?
I'd be surprised if there were income tax rises in the Conservative
So you'd
manifesto.
like to see the lock be maintained, the one that David Cameron put on, in terms of not raising income tax?
No, I certainly would not. I'm against making foolish promises or gimmicks and putting them in manifestos, because they come back to bite you.
Right. You say that because of the squeeze on living standards, you wouldn't want to see increases in income tax. But actually, if you look at spending on health, the IFS, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, that actually, once you take into account the age of the population, the amount of money we're spending on health per person will be lower in 2019-20 than it was in 2009-10. Now, people may not want to pay more income tax, but I don't think they also want their standards of healthcare to be going down either.
No, and the way in which we get more spending on the health service is by increasing the tax base, not by increasing the rates. And we do that by getting growth in the economy, by investing in the economy, and by pursuing the kind of policies which I'm sure will be in the Conservative manifesto.
We've had growth in the economy, admittedly lower in the last quarter than was expected, but we've had growth in the economy. And as I say, the IFS say that spending per person on health will be lower in 2019-20 than it was in 2009.
But the spending commitments that were made by the present government are considerably in excess of those that were promised by the Labour Party when they stood in the last general election.
All right, but
there has to be a limit.
I'm asking about the comparison, though, between what the Conservatives said they were going to do and what the Liberal Democrats are offering to do in terms of boosting health spending. If you look at education, the schools budget now, we know, is facing real terms cuts of £3 billion or 8% by 2019-20. That, obviously, you have to take into account rising pupil numbers. In the Conservative 2015 manifesto, you pledged that as the number of pupils increases, so will the amount of money in our schools. There'll be a real terms increase in the schools budget in the next Parliament. Well, you've broken that pledge. You could be honest, like the Liberal Democrats, who say they will put more money into schools by raising income tax.
We have put more money into schools. I mean, if you want to make a point of criticism, it would be that the expenditure per head has not increased,
no.
but the total expenditure. But it's completely
but you said a
wrong.
real terms increase in the schools budget, even if pupil numbers go up, and that you're not going to do by 2019-20.
Well, we have increased the schools budget, but the point I want to...
Overall cash terms, but not in real terms.
You're on the wrong argument here, in my opinion, because
well, I'll decide which argument.
It isn't that. Well, hang on a second. It's a political argument, and the political argument is that it's not. You shouldn't measure success in education by inputs, by the amount that you're spending. If you look what has happened, for example, in England, where education and schools performance has soared ahead of Scotland, where they spend 20% more, there's no direct relationship between the performance of our schools and the amount you spend.
Right, but it was a promise you made in the 2015 manifesto, and in terms of rising pupil numbers, there'll be real terms cuts in pupil spending. Now, you may claim that there's no relationship between spending and outcomes, and that's perfectly credible, but it's about pledges that are made in manifestos.
Well, that's why I hope that our manifesto will be short on firm commitments and set out the broad approach which we will take towards running the economy, and that includes living within our means. I mean, listening to you talking about health and education spending, you would think that we were not actually living beyond our means to the extent of more than £50 billion a year, and that our national debt has grown to, well, if Labour had their way, we would be £2 trillion.
Although the Tories are the ones that have been in power under coalition and on their own.
Yeah, and we're being criticised, for not spending enough.
Thank you. We'll leave it there. Dick Newby, thank you.
Well, let's take a little look of the numbers in the Lib Dems manifesto. Sky's economics editor Ed Conway has been crunching through them. Here he is with his election forensics. And Ed, you went through the Labour document yesterday. We've seen Theresa May and the Chancellor saying that the numbers don't add up. You thought they did add up yesterday, in maths terms.
They've been a bit unfair, I think.
OK, what about the Lib Dems?
Yeah, well, the Lib Dems, you know, to their credit, and we'll show this in a second, this is the actual document itself, and we'll kind of whiz through a few of the main points. To their credit, like Labour, they've provided some of the actual costings of how much things are going to cost here. I'll go through a few of the key points, though, because, you know, there has been some attention on them. And one interesting thing is that they are talking not about being in government, but about being in opposition. This is, again, this is from the first few pages of their manifestos, and just kind of interesting.
Say they're just being realistic?
They are, well, perhaps, but it is, as they say in every other manifesto, Lib Democrat leader has spelt out this vision for government. This time, they're not talking about government, they're talking about opposition. Clearly, we know we are living in different times at the moment, but nonetheless, they talk about making a different case to the British people, and some might think that's smart, some might think, you know, why would you necessarily vote for them, or even pay much attention to the manifesto if it's not going to be implemented? We'll have to see. But that's kind of an interesting way to start things. The other, you know, point I think a lot of people will take from this is this talk about a second referendum.
And this is the one thing that really sets them apart from the others. I think.
It is really, yeah. Just starting down at the bottom there, so they're talking about, you know, when the terms of our future relationship with the EU have been negotiated over the next 2 years, we will, and then I'm going to go to the next page, put that deal to a vote of the British people in a referendum. And so people will actually have a say on the Brexit deal under the Lib Dems. It's one of the biggest kind of propositions they're putting ahead to the British people. Not that they're necessarily going to be elected as the government, they want to be the opposition. So those are two of the interesting points. But as for policies, and, you know, we can learn something about what they stand for by looking at their costings, looking at what they've actually provided in terms of numbers.
So this, Labour provided a separate document yesterday with their costings in it, but these are the Lib Dems figures.
These are the Lib Dems kind of figures. It's
looking
the
over these for the rest of the afternoon.
I don't know whether they kind of originally planned to do this or whether they did it quite hastily, because it's a little bit, it doesn't look quite as nice as the Labour one, but nonetheless. Look at the few, you know, big things we're talking about here. Actually, I'll tell you what, I might just zoom in a little bit so we can see that slightly more clearly. We're talking about a 1p increase in income tax. You know, that's going to be, sorry, I'll go there. That is kind of, you know, a lot of money for a lot of people. And whereas Labour, we're talking about the top 5%, this is £6.3 billion from everyone. So that is a lot of money, and that's likely to affect, you know, a lot of people. You've got corporation tax going up to 20%. You know, you're talking there against a similar kind of thing to what Labour did. There was also famously, Faisal mentioned it a little bit earlier, cannabis taxation. So they're legalising cannabis and levying a tax on it. They think that's going to bring in £1 billion a year. Whether that's optimistic or not, it's certainly interesting.
That's a huge amount of tax.
It is a lot. I mean, I guess they're expecting a lot of people will be consuming cannabis. And here you have what they're spending money on. So the minus numbers are what they're spending money on. And here's the interesting thing. So more money on schools. They talked about that a fair bit. More money on the NHS. We talked about that at the start of this week.
That's kind of slightly flipped by Labour, wasn't it? Because Labour was spending more on schools and education generally.
Exactly.
That was their biggest outlay. But for the Lib Dems, it's NHS and care. For
the Lib Dems, it's NHS and care. But actually, when you drill into these figures and tot up all of the benefits stuff, so unlike Labour, they are going to get rid of the cap, the freeze on benefits. Unlike Labour, they are pumping a bit more money in. Tot up all of the benefits stuff, and that gets to about £9.7 billion. So actually, the Lib Dems are spending more on benefits, improving the state of the benefits, improving the generosity of the benefits system, than Labour is, and indeed than on any of their other policies. You know, here, universal credit, £3.6 billion there. You've got kind of young person's bus fare as well. If I go down a little bit further, you're talking about big figures on benefits. And that's the striking thing. Labour has historically been the party of those people who are earning a bit less, who might be reliant on the welfare state traditionally, but they are actually proposing half of what the Lib Dems are proposing in terms of extra spending on benefits.
And quite a few things that are aimed at the young. They're talking about reducing the voting age to 16, and also this young people's bus pass as well. It's going to cost quite a lot of money. It's
true, and it's you know, yeah, it is quite a lot of money. £1.145 billion. You know, more than will be raised by the cannabis tax. There are some eye-catching policies here. Again, you have to ask the question, you know, if they are making the proposition they're not going to be in government, then how much of this is worth paying attention to? But I think it underlines the fact, you know, what we're seeing in these manifestos is a vision from each party about what kind of a country they would like to live in. And from the Lib Dems, you know, this is a very different vision to the one we saw from Labour. Certainly more money for education, but only a fraction of what Labour are talking about, but a lot more money for welfare. That's interesting.
OK, Ed, thanks very much.
The Liberal Democrats have launched their general election manifesto with a pledge to hold a second referendum on EU membership and a direct appeal to the 48% who voted Remain. The party says an option to stay in would be on the ballot paper next time around. Well, our political editor Faisal Islam's been speaking with the Lib Dem leader about his party's new manifesto.
So, Tim Farron, how would you describe success in this election? It seems like the fight back that you've long promised is beginning to elude you.
So the centre point of our manifesto is offering the British people some hope. The reality is that we are giving the people of this country the chance to decide on what comes next with Brexit. And if that deal that Theresa May comes back with is not good enough for you and your family, you should have the right to reject it and to vote to remain. There are too many people, we know Jeremy Corbyn, trooped through the lobbies with Theresa May and UKIP to enact the most extreme version of Brexit. And in this election, people need and deserve a choice that isn't that extreme Brexit, that gives you the final choice on what future you will have for you and your family.
So with this manifesto, you're essentially trying to rerun the referendum?
We're giving people choice about what happens next. We accept the result of the referendum last June.
Do you really?
Indeed, but I don't accept that what is coming next is something that is a given. And everybody in this country, whether you voted Leave or Remain, it kind of doesn't matter now. What does matter is the future for our children. Are we going to have a deal that is good for you, for your family? Will we have enough money for our schools and our hospitals? What will it do to prices and to jobs throughout our country? So we shouldn't have to just accept, like and lump, whatever deal Theresa May and Brussels cook up between them. We, as a community, you should have the right to have the final say. And if you do not like Theresa May's deal, you should have the right to remain, because Britain deserves some hope that there is another alternative to the bleak trajectory that Theresa May, backed by Jeremy Corbyn and UKIP, are taking us upon.
You've got an interesting reference to what are currently illegal drugs. Are you seriously scoring on your manifesto costings, raising £1 billion from cannabis?
What we've done is...
As part of your costings for your manifesto?
We had an expert panel to make sure that we have a drugs policy which actually works, rather than the black market situation we have now. I mean, whatever money drugs raise at the moment goes into the pockets of the criminal gangs. And the principal objective, two objectives of our policy, which is based almost identically on the scheme that Canada will introduce across its country this year, is to minimise harm and indeed to make sure that we take back control from the criminal gangs. So you would make sure that most drugs would of course remain illegal, but you would regulate cannabis so that you can ensure that the most dangerous strains are not legal. So you make sure that there is not the crossover from the use of cannabis into hard drugs, because you build a hard wall between the two. And above all else, you take back control from the criminal gangs.
So I have to ask, have you partaken yourself?
Many, many years ago at college.
You've had to defend against some of the comments you've made, some of the views, some personal religious views. Something's emerged today that you said a decade ago about abortion. Do you stand by what was said there about not backing abortion?
Well, I mean, I'm pro-choice now, and I was pro-choice then. I think women should have access to safe and legal abortion.
So you're not going to be Prime Minister. I think that's probably a prediction we can maybe share. Who would you prefer as Prime Minister, Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn?
Theresa May called this election because she knows she's going to win it, and not in the Conservative, well, not only in the Conservative Party's interest and not in the country's interest. What Britain needs, however, is a voice that is alternative, that does not just shrug its shoulders and give up to the extreme version of Brexit that Jeremy Corbyn, UKIP and the Conservatives want together, but one which is brighter than that and which offers a real hope for the future. The Liberal Democrats are offering that. And in this election, the more votes we get, the more seats we get, the more we can change the direction of this country away from the bleak one that Theresa May offers to a brighter one that I'm offering you.
Tim Farron there in conversation with our political editor. Faisal joins us now. Faisal, I was going to say he's got his big idea. I was going to say he's peddling it furiously, but perhaps not quite the right jargon.
Well, in terms of Brexit, if that's what you were talking about, that clearly is front and centre in this manifesto. It's the first 5-6 pages, plenty of pictures of Tim Farron at EU rallies. The EU flag flutters throughout this document. It is the way in which he gets the attention of a proportion of the electorate, a proportion of the 48% who feel that they may not be happy with what the Prime Minister, who is elected on June the 8th, what they managed to negotiate from Europe, and he thinks that there is a constituency of millions of people who want to have a say on that. Now, the other parties obviously argue that they had their say a year ago. They'll have a say of sorts as well at the general election. But I think the extent to which this fight back, this Lib Dem surge that some had expected after the referendum has occurred, well, the local election results were a bit of a hammer blow to the Lib Dems in terms of the number of seats that they lost. So they stress that their vote share is going up, but they have to try to turn that into parliamentary seats to up that total from the woeful total of 8, now 9, after the by-election in Richmond Park. Richmond Park featuring on the back. The problem is the whole country is not the same as Richmond Park, and Mr Farron is still betting everything on Brexit. There are some other policies as well. I talked to him there about this idea of £1 billion raised from legalising cannabis and then taxing it. But he's also intriguingly going a little bit further than Labour Party on things like benefits. He's going to unfreeze the Conservative freeze on working age benefits at the cost of £3 billion. That's the thing that Jeremy Corbyn got into a pickle about. In general, though, the message is essentially on Brexit from Tim Farron that Theresa May, Jeremy Corbyn and UKIP are all pursuing the same type of Brexit, and he's the only person that can, quote, change Britain's future. That's the sell. It's up to the public as to whether they think that Brexit is the central issue in this election. Colin.
Thanks, Faisal.
Well, we have quite a lot of detail from the Lib Dems about what they intend to do with the economy if they were ever to get control of it. Let's leave aside the fact that in the manifesto they said they don't actually want to be in government, and have a look at the numbers, starting with this, what they're going to spend their money on. In this column, I've got all of the promises for the things they're going to spend their money on. This is by 2019-20, and a lot of it goes on education and extra grants. You've got £6.3 billion for the NHS and for social care. On top of that, you have benefits. Actually, a lot of money going on benefits. £9.7 billion, almost £10 billion to be spent on benefits. Things like reversing the government's welfare cap and making universal credits a little bit more generous. You've got a public sector pay cap, and that's going to be reversed. That's going to cost about £2 to £3 billion. And then on top of that, you've got others, just a few other policies as well. The total amount of spending the Lib Dems are proposing comes to £30 billion. But will they afford it with what they intend to raise in taxes? Well, let's have a look on the tax side. Income tax they want to raise for everyone by 1p. Basic rate of income tax up by 1p. That's going to raise £6.3 billion, will affect everyone. Corporation tax up by £3.6 billion. Then you have a few other taxes, such as the cannabis tax. They expect obviously to legalise cannabis, but also to raise £1 billion from taxing it. As well as that, you've got a few other things as well. And like Labour yesterday, some avoidance, a few extra £1 billion raised through avoidance. No one's ever entirely sure how you can raise that, but nonetheless, it helps get that number up. But as you can see, this column here, what they're getting in taxes, is much shorter than that column there. And that's because they intend to borrow the difference. There's about £14 billion of extra borrowing every year under these Lib Dem plans, and that will raise the amount of borrowing that the government would have to do. This shows you the annual deficit for the UK government over the course of the last few years. You can see it's come down each year under the coalition government and then into the Conservative government. They're planning to get it even further down in the next few years. And we heard yesterday from Labour that they would actually have slightly higher borrowing in the next few years. They do actually make their numbers balance on the current budget, but they want to spend all this on investment. The Lib Dems would have slightly less borrowing each year than Labour, but nonetheless higher borrowing than there is at the moment, which of course would mean a higher national debt in the long run. But there is one thing that's rather interesting. When you compare the Lib Dem plans with the Labour plans, and we're going to do this for all of the manifestos, such as they give us the data for it, what is it that their priorities are? We know that the Lib Dems want to spend about £9 billion on education. They want to spend £6.3 billion on the NHS and social care. And over here on welfare, they want to spend about £10 billion. How does this compare to what Labour told us about yesterday? It gives us a real sense of what they think is important, what the priorities they think are. Well, with Labour, by far and away, the biggest chunk of what they wanted to spend their money on was this, education, both schools, but more importantly, and a bigger amount, on tuition fees, reversing tuition fees, £25 billion billion in total on that. On the NHS, they spend similar, a little bit more under the Lib Dems on that, £7.7 billion. But look at this, Lib Dems spending £10 billion on welfare, Labour spending only 4.6, less than half of what the Lib Dems are talking about. And given how much Jeremy Corbyn has talked about inequality, you might be quite surprised to see that disparity there from the Labour Party, so little on welfare. But yesterday, you might remember this chart we showed you comparing the plans and looking at the tax burden. The higher this is, the greater the burden of taxes, basically tax as a percentage of GDP, going all the way back here to 1948. At the moment, the government plans do involve a rise in the tax burden in the next few years. These are government Conservative plans going up a little bit, actually the highest for quite some time. Labour, we saw this yesterday, would rise it up to there. It would be the highest level since 1949. What about what the Lib Dem plans would do? Well, we know they're going to raise taxes a little bit. This is what would happen. They'd be somewhere in between the two, actually closer to the government plans, but nonetheless, actually, that's the highest tax burden since around here. That's 1969. So nonetheless, a higher tax burden from the Lib Dems, a much higher tax burden from Labour. As for the Conservatives, well, we'll hear from them tomorrow.
Well, Siobhan Robbins has been following the Liberal Democrat campaign, usually on the bus, not today, in East London, as you see. Siobhan, welcome to you. Tim Farron's decided to bet the farm, really, on Brexit, hasn't he, this idea of a second referendum. I suppose, unfortunately for him, if you look at recent polls, and I'm thinking of one that was in the FT, showing that only 22% of Britons polled now want to see a second referendum. He hasn't got that many people to play with.
Yes, and they still, despite that, have put Brexit at the centre of their manifesto. Before we get onto the manifesto, I just want to show you where I am. This is where they're going to do the official launch tonight. We're going to give you a little sneak preview. So the press will be up here having a look at what Tim Farron's doing. You can see they're dressing the stage here. That's where Tim Farron will be standing later this evening, talking about his manifesto. As you can see on the lectern there, change Britain's future. Change Britain's future, that's what they're saying this manifesto is all about. So what is in it? Well, lots of the stuff we brought to you over the last few weeks. There's that boost for the NHS. They say they'll bring in 30 billion over the term of Parliament by raising taxes by 1%, 7 billion for schools, a promise to pump money into infrastructure, into railways, HS2, build more homes. But like you said, at the centre of it all is this pledge about Brexit, giving people a second vote on the referendum. And what they're essentially saying is, we voted for Brexit, but we didn't know what Brexit actually meant. So we need to see what that deal is on the table and then get a chance to vote on it. Now, for people who are firmly Remain, which they are in some of the areas in London, which backs the Liberal Democrats, that will play very well. They'll be very happy to feel that they have another choice. But then there are other areas, such as the South West, which was a Liberal Democrat heartland, which we saw turn blue in the last election. Many people there voted Leave. And when I was talking to people today, some are really angry at the very idea of the fact that almost like their vote in the referendum's being ignored. They're saying out means out. So it is quite a dangerous strategy for the Liberal Democrats, but they're saying this is what they want to do. They're pinning their colours to the mast and saying a vote for them is a vote for a Brexit election.
They're differentiating themselves, Siobhan, aren't they? And one way they're doing that is by saying if we're in government, we'll legalise cannabis. Oh, and by the way, we'll raise £1 billion in so doing.
Yes, this was something that they first announced at the end of last week, and essentially what it was that they're saying that a huge amount of police time is spent dealing with people who are taking cannabis. Also, so many people are taking it that at the moment you can't control the potency, you can't control the market. So what they want to do is legal.
We kept the pictures, we lost the sound, apologies.